So it's been almost a decade since I first got into programming, and the industry has evolved pretty rapidly since then, especially with AI and large language models like ChatGPT. So the landscape does look a lot different for people starting out today, but in my opinion, in a good way. Here's how I would use tools like ChatGPT to accelerate the learning process if I were starting out today. Before I do that, I want to quickly look at the typical components of the learning process, so you can start to think about how an LLM or any new tool you come across might be a useful aid. You generally start out with some learning outcome or goal, and a teacher will lay out a roadmap or syllabus for you to get there. That'll also include some type of resources for you to be exposed to the material, a book, lectures, videos. There's usually a hands-on component like a lab, exercises, or projects. This is especially important with programming because we're basically building things, and the only way to learn that is to, build things. So now you don't always understand every concept right away. Things you're building don't always work right away, or if they do, you might still want ideas for improvement. So intelligent feedback at these steps is usually necessary. And then finally, integrating the new knowledge or skills usually requires some type of active recall over time, either just through studying or consistently applying what you learned. Alright, now let's look at an actual example. We're going to use a prompt that will have ChatGPT create a detailed study plan for someone looking to learn Python. So here's a prompt that I came up with. For creating effective prompts, I found that the key is to establish context and be as specific as possible. You can tailor it for your own needs, but here's a typical example. There's a couple of things I did here to establish context. So first you want to give the agent a role. The agent here I'm referring to ChatGPT, the model. And then you want to give it an objective. Here I give it an objective of creating a custom study plan based on the student's time commitment and learning style. Then you want to establish some constraints. So I gave it some constraints based off of time to tailor it specifically, to tailor the roadmap specifically to how much time someone can give per week. Then the preferred learning style, so it would emphasize reading. So it will give you books and articles as opposed to videos if that's your learning style, but you can also tailor it for yourself. And then also to establish a current skill level of the student so that it can filter resources based off of that and maybe give our response a little bit higher quality. And then once that context is established, you just give it a call to action and we go ahead. Alright, now let's take a look at what it gave us back. So within seconds we have an 8-week study plan for beginner Python, and just as a first glance, it does look like it kind of fits the skeleton of whatever you'd find at a beginner course in college or at a boot camp or something. You know, we have basic concepts, control flow, functions, modules, error handling, and final project. So just going back to the learning process I was talking about earlier, right? We basically just within seconds covered the goal, exposure, we have a resource, and what's neat here is I noticed that it was able to automate the boring stuff with Python, which is a very highly recommended and completely free online book for learning Python. All right, so here you go here. The full text of this is free online, and it was able to identify that for you. And you have resources, you have projects, and it also identifies HackerRank, LeetCode, CodeWars, just platforms that you could do where you can find practice problems. So that's pretty cool. We have basically 1, 2, and 3 covered. Now let's look at what it could do as far as feedback. So testing and code reviews are a fundamental part of the software development process. Let's take a look at a simple example where ChatGPT could potentially find issues in code that aren't immediately obvious. So here I have a prompt, and following the same principles of prompt creation, we're going to establish some context or tell it act as a software engineer and provide feedback on the following code snippet. Provide possible improvements and highlight potential bugs. Now, this code doesn't have any syntax errors. It runs correctly with some sample inputs, but there are some issues, and let's see if it can highlight it for us. Alright, so let's take a look at the feedback that ChatGPT was able to give us. So the input was simply a snippet of code that takes two two numbers as input and divides them and prints the result. So the first bug that it identified was that we're not handling division by zero. When you're dividing numbers and the input is not controlled, you could potentially get a zero, and that would raise a zero division error. So that's one thing that we didn't take care of in our program. The second thing that we didn't take care of was input validation. So we just have lines of code that are asking for user input and expecting a number. We're not validating or telling the program what to do if we don't get a number. Now, next thing it talks about is return types. So now it's getting more into general best practices for avoiding bugs in larger programs. Here our program is very simple, so it might not be that relevant, but generally speaking, it's telling us that when handling errors, a function returns a string. The mixed return type, it could be either a float or a string, can lead to confusion and bugs in larger programs. It would be better to handle errors through exceptions or consistent error messages. So just a nudge as far as best practices go. And similarly for print statements, it's telling us that instead of having a print statement coming out from the global scope, which just means that in the main part of the program, user interaction and printing to the console or whatever your interface is should be its separate thing. It's just kind of nudging us and telling us a little bit about best practices. Again, with best practices, it's telling us we should document our function. So this is kind of the type of feedback you'd expect from a code review. Now, when it comes to integration, this really just refers to using your knowledge and skills over time. And with programming, this basically just means continue building things. So I think as far as utilizing ChatGPT to help you clarify that, one thing you could do is look at what your next options could be to start building non-trivial applications. So here's a prompt that we could use to see what ChatGPT suggests for us. Now again, we're going to establish some context and put some constraints and see what it tells us. Act as a programming instructor and propose potential next steps to a student that finished learning the basics of Python. They have a good grasp of basic syntax, operators, control flow, data structures. They can do file handling, error handling, but now they want to know what they would like to explore non-trivial things they could build and what they need to learn to build them. Okay, so now as expected, it gives some potential things that you could explore to start building non-trivial applications. So web development, data analysis and visualization, automation and scripting, game development, machine learning and AI, Internet of Things, network and security. So these are typical paths after you have the basic language down. And here again, it gives you skills that you could learn, projects that you can do, and then you could basically just go through that cycle again, and that would cover integrating your knowledge. If you continue to build and explore and learn, you're obviously going to use the basics, and I think it applies to other things that you might learn as well, because in learning you have this concept called chunking, right? When you have associated knowledge, your brain kind of consolidates that into one thing. So now after that first path, it might be Python the language, maybe you go into web development, you learn Django. Now your mind is on autopilot with the earlier stuff. Now you're learning Django, and then eventually Django and Python, they both become autopilot, and you advance and become more and more skilled as you go on. I just want to clarify some things before I end. I understand ChatGPT or LLMs in general aren't a silver bullet. They do make mistakes. Even in the roadmap I generated, I noticed the chapters in the Python textbook didn't really match the topics. In addition, some people may argue that it isn't really necessary to use ChatGPT to learn to code, or there's a better way to do any of these things, and that's fine. I know the space is filled with a lot of hype, change, unknowns, opinions, and the industry is complicated, and it's hard to predict the future. The most constructive mindset, in my opinion, is to be a resourceful problem solver. With this simple example, we showed if we clearly define a problem space, in this case the learning process, and have a general sense of the capabilities of a tool, we can use it to supplement whatever we're doing or a part of what we're doing. In my humble opinion, after the hype, once the dust settles, the most effective people will be the ones who figured out what these tools, LLMs, or other AI products can and can't do, and how they can be applied to their specific use case. I hope to be one of those people, and I hope you are too. Thanks for watching.